Danny Sheehan and Ross Coulthart just dropped a bomb on Sean Kirkpatrick, the UFO cover-up, and the United States national security state secrecy regime. Just came out a couple hours ago. Ross Coulthart on News Nation. That's the guy who interviewed David Grusch last year. He's starting a new show called Reality Check, where he's going to be diving into important topics, UAP being front and center. So Coulthart comes out with this, and he's reiterating that he's constantly talking to people that are actually allegedly working on these UFO retrieval and reverse engineering programs. Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop Grumman. Coulthart comes bold in this video. He's calling the Pentagon liars straight up, and he's saying that people are telling him that they're working on these programs. And he names the companies too, so pretty bold from Coulthart. Now, the crux of this hour-long episode is that he's having Danny Sheehan on to speak, and Sheehan really drops the bomb. I encourage you to watch the whole interview if you have time, but here I'm going to pull out the key points. And really quickly, Danny Sheehan, you can do your research onto who he is. He has been practicing law basically for 50 years, Harvard lawyer. He was involved in a lot of historical cases like the Pentagon Papers, the Iran-Contra scandal, Watergate, all of those big high-profile cases of the 70s where the government, particularly the executive branch, got caught lying, being corrupt, etc. So that's his whole specialty, this guy Danny Sheehan, and he's gotten involved with the UFO issue. And one of the reasons he got involved with it was back in the 70s with President Jimmy Carter. He was part of the legal team that Carter made an executive order for the Congress to investigate the UFO issue to see if there was any evidence of non-human intelligence, basically, and craft and so forth. Because when he asked George H.W. Bush, the CIA director at the time, to brief him, Bush told him, "You don't have a need to know." So that's how Sheehan got into this all. And one last note about Sheehan, he really seems like he would be one of the people to help bring the truth about the UFOs and the aliens out, because he's been in the circles of certain people, like with the Pentagon Papers, who basically broke the law in terms of the Espionage Act and just leaking stuff and just being bold and coming out and saying, this is what I saw, this is what I know. So it kind of makes sense that he comes from that sort of a background and ethos, and he's dropping some bombs here. So what does Sheehan tell us? Well, he says that when he was doing that investigation for Carter in the 70s, late 70s, he was given authority, he was given access to go see the Project Blue Book files of the part of the 700 cases that were unexplainable, aka legitimate UFO sightings and evidence of them. And he was brought, as he describes it, down to a very low bottom level of part of the National Archives, where there were big security guards, and then he was allowed to view some microfilm canisters and look at the documents, and that's what was on there. And he had a limited amount of time. All he had with him was his legal pad, and he was going through as fast as he could. He really there was so much pages of documents, he just wanted to find a picture and see if he could get anything to go back to help the investigation he was a part of for President Carter. And lo and behold, after a while, he did see a picture. And this picture was a crashed flying saucer, which he said was unmistakably your classic-looking saucer with the dome on top. And he said it was stuck into an embankment in the snow. And around the flying saucer were Air Force personnel. They were dressed in Air Force gear, and they were taking pictures and videos standing around the saucer. So Sheehan says he saw this. The other interesting thing is that he said he saw symbols on the craft. And they weren't hieroglyphics, they weren't Chinese script, they weren't anything of known human civilizations. And so he said what he did is he took his yellow legal pad and basically on the back cardboard side traced the symbols through the screen. I guess like the projection came onto the pad where he could trace the symbols. And basically he got up and left right away. And security guards kind of looked through his notebook, but the drawing was all the way on the backing cardboard and they didn't see it, and he got out. He gave that data over to the investigative team that he was a part of, and he says that he really never saw it again. But he saw the photo when he was there, and he actually thinks that actually never got relayed to President Carter. Now, here's where this bridges it to today. And one last note, that investigative committee that Carter ordered in the late 70s, they ultimately gave him their final report where they concluded, and I actually hadn't heard this before, they concluded to President Carter that there were between 2 and 6 highly advanced non-human intelligence civilizations in our galaxy. So that was told to Carter back in 77, 78. Now, getting to today and what's going on now with the Pentagon AARO Sean Kirkpatrick report that just came out last week denying that there's any substantial evidence of anything. In this interview with Ross Coulthart, Sheehan tells us that he went to AARO, told the exact same story that you can listen to him tell, that I just paraphrased, told it to Kirkpatrick under oath, and Kirkpatrick wrote the report, and he point blank just says that he's being lying. Ross asks him to state his opinion on what the report is and Kirkpatrick's intentions, and Danny Sheehan says, quote, he calls the report, quote, a transparent, conscious, willful lie. So he's making that distinction between just a lack of information versus Kirkpatrick is just lying. That's what Danny Sheehan is saying, and that he's prepared to testify to that under oath before Congress. They also mentioned this executive order that Ronald Reagan signed back in the 80s that said that the intelligence community could not carry out agendas that would misinform the public about certain issues for their own political goals, and that this is in violation of that. Other interesting info that Sheehan shares, in the UAP Disclosure Act, the Schumer bill, the Schumer-Rounds Amendment as it's been called, there's some ambiguity as to what happened, why did it get gutted? There hasn't been really much details about that. Sheehan was in those circles of what was happening, and he says it was Mike Turner, who's the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, or Armed Services, I think, Intelligence Committee, and Mike Johnson, and he said that they refused to put the UAP disclosure bill for a vote on the House floor unless the enforcement provisions, meaning the pieces of the law that actually make it enforceable. Otherwise, you're just saying, hey, show us what you got. But if there's no enforceable legal punishments, then nothing can happen. And they had those taken out. He also mentions that this can be pursued as a lawsuit under a Racketeering Act. We've heard Stephen Greer in the Disclosure Project talk about that as well. Now, here's another interesting thing. Danny Sheehan tells us that he already has set up the New Paradigm Institute. And part of that is something called Citizens for Disclosure. And they're going to be setting up action teams in all 435 congressional districts. That means wherever you live if you're in the United States. And it's going to be this massive campaign to basically write to Congress, to the representatives, and push for hearings, because we need these hearings. That's the whole thing. And in terms of did Kirkpatrick follow up on the testimony that Danny Sheehan gave him under oath about the pictures he saw in the National Archives, and to Sheehan's knowledge, Kirkpatrick did not follow up. He says he could have verified that Sheehan was there at that date. It would all be in the records, that they brought him the Blue Book files, that he went in the basement at the National Archives, that another person involved who's still active could be called upon to testify to corroborate his story. They could have done all of that, and then they could have even accessed the files and Kirkpatrick could have seen for himself this crashed UFO in the snow that Sheehan says he saw. Another point that Danny Sheehan shares in this interview with Ross Coulthart, he says that he interviewed someone named Albert Stein, who was part of Project Blue Book and was involved in those 700 unexplained cases. This guy, Albert Stein, called Sheehan on his deathbed to come. Sheehan went there, and this guy, Albert Stein, told him that he was literally shown physical craft at S4 in Area 51. So another interesting little tidbit. And so in closing it out, Danny talks about how really since 1947 and the National Security Act, it's allowed the executive branch really to just lie about anything that they want at will, with impunity. And the only time where that really got brought out to light and exposed was there was a period around what was called the Church Committee and that whole era. And basically that made some more stipulations to hold the intelligence community accountable. Ultimately, over time, led to the intelligence inspector generals and what we have now that's relatively recently. And there's a good book actually called The State of Secrecy where you can read about this whole history. So it's really interesting to see the UFO issue playing into this larger history. Now, also in wrapping up, and to that point, and I agree with Sheehan on this, he's saying that the inspector generals of the intelligence community are not doing their job in pushing for hearings. Like Thomas Monheim should already have been like, all right, let's go, let's set up a committee in hearings. But so what's holding him back? You know, that's a really important thing to push on, I think. And Coulthart says that when he was walking around the Capitol building, senators were stopping him in the hallway, recognizing him from the News Nation Grusch interview and saying, hey, we're with you on this. We're going to fight for this. If that's true, that's awesome. You know, that's a good sign. So this is all good news. And on a final note, something I've been thinking about is what constitutional violation is at play here. And I was thinking about this recently. Coulthart asked Danny Sheehan that, and Danny says that it's Article 1. It's separation of powers. It's that Congress has the authority to set up and regulate the military intelligence agencies and their, and the right to punish them legally for not following that. And that's what all this falls under. He's saying point blank that the Pentagon, AARO, Sean Kirkpatrick is straight up knowingly lying about this UFO, extraterrestrial, alien, non-human intelligence, whatever you want to call it, that they're just lying about it straight up. And this is super interesting to see this develop. I think it's a good sign to see that someone like Danny Sheehan's going out there dropping these bombs. Coulthart doesn't care. It doesn't seem like he cares. He's really going to just push on this. He says that himself. And I think this is a good sign. And in wrapping up, and I can really relate to this, Ross Coulthart says, quote, "Do Americans give a flying hoot? I don't know if they do." And I agree. Some people I speak to in different circles, they still just think this is like a fringe, like a joke topic. People don't even realize that this is going on, but history will play out however this does. It's super interesting either way. On a final note, you can go to newparadigminstitute.org, and all you have to do is put in your zip code, and it'll pop up your representatives in Congress right there. New Paradigm Institute has like some kind of pre-written message to ask them to push for these hearings, and you could just send it on your behalf that you support it and that you want them to do an investigation about this issue. So definitely check that out, and I think this is good news, fascinating stuff. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.